the starting point and the basis of everything we are doing. After the demise of socialism in Eastern Europe in the mid-90s, Cuba adopted emergency measures to survive. Cuba has maintained the social achievements and growth of the economy in very difficult circumstances. Cuba needs to continue developing its economy and society, but it has to face several challenges that causes the loss of billions of dollars every year. Thank you. One challenge: economic sanctions and U.S. policy against Cuba. In 50 years, the U.S. economic sanctions have cost hundreds of billions of dollars to the Cuban economy. Why? Because U.S. citizens cannot travel to Cuba unless they are licensed by the U.S. government. Cuba cannot export to the U.S. Cuba cannot trade with U.S. companies in third countries. U.S. punishes and threatens foreign companies that do business or invest in Cuba. Cuba cannot develop a normal trade with the U.S. and in general cannot import from the U.S. Cuba can only import medicines and food from the U.S. under difficult conditions. Cuba cannot use the U.S. dollar in its transactions, and the U.S. prevents or hinders Cuban access to international credit. So the current U.S. government has allowed travel and remittances only by Cuban Americans to Cuba, and announced in January this year limited permission to send remittances by American citizens to Cuba, and the authorization of licenses for travel to Cuba for religious, educational, academic, and journalists, only if they permit them to do so. That does not mean a substantial change in the sanctions policy, because everything that I mentioned. This means that if we cannot receive more than 1 million Americans a year in Cuba as visitors, we are losing billions of dollars. If we cannot export anything to the U.S., we are losing billions of dollars. If we cannot use the U.S. dollar, it costs more our transactions, because we have to convert everything we pay into other currencies. And still today, the U.S. dollar is the main currency used internationally, or one of the main currencies used international to do trade. At the same time, the U.S. maintains a policy of interference in the internal affairs of Cuba. It maintains its policy to discredit Cuba, including keeping Cuba in the list of terrorist states. Only 4 countries in the world are in the U.S. lists of terrorist states, including Cuba. Anybody in the world believes that, not even themselves. But it's a matter of punishment against Cuba. They have included Cuba since 1982 in this list. And at the same time, Posada Carriles is free in the United States after bombing a civil Cuban airline, killing 76 people. And keeps our 5 Cuban prisoners who fought against terrorism, and maintains a military base in the Cuban province of Guantanamo. So climate change is another challenge that Cuba has. Hurricanes, droughts, and floods. In 10 years, only because of hurricanes, Cuba has lost $20 billion in 10 years. The other challenge, international financial crisis. In 10 years, the price changes of commodities, of food, everything we need, have caused losses to Cuba of more than $10 billion. So if you combine the effect of all those challenges, it is difficult to see how a small country that has less population than the province of Ontario can keep these results against all these challenges and all these obstacles that Cuba has to face. After 50 years of social and economic progress, after overcoming the economic crisis of the 90s caused by the dual effect of the disappearance of markets in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and the increasing U.S. economic sanctions, and to continue addressing the threats posed by U.S. policy, taking into account also the economic and financial crisis and other challenges, it became necessary to update the Cuban economic model. We are moving from what we needed to do after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, which meant for us that we lost our markets in a matter of a few years. We lost 85% of our markets. So we need to move forward from that and we need to look forward in a manner that keeps what we have achieved so far, but also that allows us to move faster and better. And I would like to remember that when the Soviet Union and the socialist countries of Eastern Europe disappeared, and when Cuba had the most difficult situation in order to survive, because we are talking about not having enough medicines, and food, and oil to survive, what the US did was to make their sanctions worse against Cuba. No, not to help Cuba, their neighbor, because we are their neighbors, and that's why we offered them 1,500 doctors when they were hit by Hurricane Katrina, which the Bush administration didn't accept. But the reality is this one. This is a challenge that we still have today, and basically the policy hasn't changed. So at that point, we adopted several measures to address the consequences of the economic crisis that started in the 90s. We opened it to international tourism, to foreign investment. We legalized the possession of and use of foreign currency. We modernized the policy and system of production and energy conservation in Cuba. And we increased domestic energy production. We developed urban and suburban agriculture. We developed social programs to confront the consequences, social consequences of that economic crisis. We adopted measures to ensure the country's financial sovereignty, and we created the Cuban convertible peso. So the US dollar is no longer legal tender in Cuba, but of course anybody can have deposits in US dollars in Cuba. The only thing is that we need to convert that into other currencies if we want to pay for anything, because otherwise it will be frozen anywhere by the economic sanctions, US economic sanctions. We did major investments in social infrastructure, medical, educational, energy, transportation, and communications, and industrial. So these changes occurred in a context of greater integration of Cuba to Latin America and the Caribbean as possible after the triumph of the progressive political processes in Latin America, first in the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Since 2004, Cuba has developed a policy and economic alliance with several Latin American and Caribbean countries called ALBA, which include countries such as Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This alliance aims to Latin America and Caribbean integration with economic development and social justice. Cuba has also developed economic relations with other countries such as China, Russia, and Brazil. On July 31st, 2006, Cuban President Fidel Castro announced that for health reasons he decided to delegate his functions as head of state, government, and the party in the first vice president of Cuba, Raúl Castro. An interim stage began, which lasted until February 2008, when general elections were held in Cuba, which are held every 5 years. The Cuban Revolution leader Fidel Castro decided he will not seek nor accept the post of president, and in February 2008, Raúl Castro was elected as president of Cuba. I would like to explain here that Raúl is president of the Council of State and of Ministers of Cuba. Cuba has a Council of State of 31 members. Of those, 5 are vice presidents, and all of them are elected by the 600 members of the National Assembly of Cuba, who at the same time are elected every 5 years. So it happens simultaneously. There is a general election in Cuba where the National Assembly is elected, including 600 members, and from within, from those members of the National Assembly, the members of the Council of State are elected, including the president and 5 vice presidents. So from 2008, new economic measures were adopted. The reduction and reorganization of the state workforce, and the extension of non-state employment as an alternative of work and economic growth. The delivery of state lands in usufruct to increase agricultural production and cultivated lands and reduce imports. Who is the country in the world that gives land to its people in order for them to be in a better position to produce food for themselves? And I know there are many good initiatives in other countries, but what I'm mentioning is this is an initiative from our government in order to have benefited. In this case, 100,000 Cuban families have benefited from this program. For us, it's like a second land reform, in a way that the only condition for those families that are receiving the land is that they have to put it to produce. We are not giving hand to anybody to have it idle without any production. But at the same time, it allows Cuba to reduce imports. So also the adoption of a new Social Security Act to facilitate the incorporation of more people to work was established. And in this case, we did it after a national process of asking everybody their opinions, especially the workers, their opinion about the new Social Security Act. Basically, it was approved to have more people working, even giving facilities or facilitating for those that for some or any reason decided to retire, to go back to work and to receive both benefits, retirement benefits and the new job benefits. Other economic measure that's been adopted from 2008 is the elimination of subsidies and improper gratuities by the state in Cuba without a social security justification or without an economic justification. The promotions of savings of resources in all economic activities, eliminating unnecessary regulations and prohibitions that belong to other era or part of our history, but still they were there. The strengthening of state institutions and the rule of law, the adoption of measures for more efficient government. For example, from January 2011, Havana province disappeared and two new provinces were created, the province of Mayabeque and the province of Artemisa, to facilitate a more effective local government. We had a province in this case with 19 different municipalities, and it was really difficult for the provincial government to deal with the 19 different municipalities. So the province was separated into two new different provinces. So now each of the provinces has their own local government to facilitate their job. Since November 2010, a process of national discussion began of a draft update of the Cuban economic model submitted by the government. The discussion ends 2 months from now, in April this year, with the adoption of new measures. Key aspects of the new guidelines of economic and social development of Cuba are to increase productivity and agriculture production and agribusiness, to reduce food imports and to continue the delivery of vacant land, to recover the production of sugar and its derivatives, to increase industrial output in pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, nickel, mineral and chemical industry, to reuse or reallocate the workforce by eliminating excess labor force, mainly in the state sector of the economy,